Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1874, and autumn had descended upon the Ozark Mountains with particular severity. The settlement of Hollow Creek, nestled between the rolling hills of southwestern Missouri, was preparing for what locals predicted would be an unusually harsh winter. Situated approximately 30 miles south of Springfield, this small community of roughly 200 souls maintained a fragile existence, dependent upon timber harvesting and subsistence farming. The Rockbridge homestead stood apart from the others, a two-story farmhouse constructed of local pine and limestone, positioned on the northern ridge overlooking Blackwater Valley. The property had belonged to the Rockbridge family since 1851, when Thomas Rockbridge claimed the land after relocating from Pennsylvania following the death of his first wife. What transpired at the Rockbridge property during that fateful October would become the subject of both official investigation and persistent local speculation for decades to come. County records indicate that on October 17, 1874, Clara Rockbridge, age 32, the second wife of Thomas Rockbridge, was reported missing by her husband. The Springfield Register documented the report with just 3 lines on page 7 of its October 19th edition. Mrs. Clara Rockbridge of Hollow Creek has gone missing from her residence. Mr. Thomas Rockbridge reports she was last seen attending to household matters on Saturday evening. Anyone with knowledge of her whereabouts is asked to contact the county sheriff's office. What the newspaper failed to mention, and what would only emerge through subsequent investigation, was that Clara had reportedly been in a state of increasing distress in the weeks before her disappearance. According to statements later collected by Sheriff James Hargrove, at least 4 neighbors had observed Clara in town displaying what was described as nervous agitation and uncharacteristic withdrawal. Martha Simmons, who operated the general store, told investigators that Clara had purchased unusual quantities of candles and lamp oil during her last visit, remarking that the darkness seemed to be growing stronger at the Rockbridge home. When questioned further, Martha could not elaborate on what Clara might have meant by such a statement. The official investigation into Clara's disappearance was initially cursory. Thomas Rockbridge was respected in the community, having served as a deacon at the Hollow Creek Methodist Church for over 15 years. His account of events was taken at face value. Clara had been melancholy throughout the summer months, and he assumed she had finally acted on previous threats to return to her family in Illinois. However, Sheriff Hargrove's ledger, now preserved in the Greene County Historical Society archives, reveals a notable inconsistency. No coach or wagon driver reported transporting a woman matching Clara's description during that period, and the nearest train station in Springfield had no record of a ticket purchased under her name. The settlement of Hollow Creek itself bears some examination, as its particular geography and isolation contributed significantly to the events that unfolded. Established in 1842 by timber merchants seeking to exploit the region's abundant pine forests, the community had developed a reputation for self-sufficiency and, some might say, insularity. Surrounded on 3 sides by steep ridges and accessible primarily by a single wagon road that frequently became impassable during winter months, Hollow Creek residents had necessarily developed strong interdependencies. The nearest substantial town, Springfield, represented a full day's journey by wagon under optimal conditions. This isolation meant that local matters were generally handled internally with minimal involvement from county authorities. The Rockbridge property occupied what many considered the prime location within this secluded valley. Positioned on elevated ground approximately 2 miles north of the town center, the homestead commanded views across much of the surrounding landscape while remaining partially concealed by a stand of ancient oak trees. The original structure, a modest cabin, had been expanded considerably under Thomas Rockbridge's ownership, eventually incorporating a second story, a wraparound porch, and several outbuildings. Most distinctive was the root cellar, unusually large by local standards, and constructed with limestone blocks quarried from the northern ridge. According to architectural assessments conducted in the 1930s as part of a historical survey, the cellar walls were nearly 2 feet thick, an excessive measure even considering the practical need for food preservation. What makes the Rockbridge case particularly unsettling is not simply the disappearance itself, but rather the circumstances surrounding the household in the months prior. Thomas Rockbridge had married Clara Weber in 1868, following a brief courtship when she arrived in the area to serve as a schoolteacher. By all accounts, the marriage appeared agreeable for the first 4 years. The couple was regularly seen at community gatherings, and Clara was described as quiet but pleasant by those who knew her. However, beginning in approximately March of 1874, several witnesses reported a marked change in the dynamics of the household. The Rockbridge property employed 2 laborers, Jeremiah Caldwell, who managed the small timber operation on the western acreage, and Samuel Thatcher, who assisted with general farm work. According to a statement Caldwell provided to the sheriff in November 1874, Thomas Rockbridge had become increasingly particular about the boundaries of the property. New fencing was erected around the perimeter, and both workers were instructed not to approach the main house after sundown under any circumstances. Caldwell described an incident in April when he had sought Thomas's approval regarding a timber contract after dinner hours. He reported observing Thomas emerging from the cellar entrance at the rear of the house, appearing disheveled and agitated, insisting that all property matters must henceforth be discussed during daylight hours. Local records provide some context for Thomas Rockbridge's background prior to his arrival in the Ozarks. Born in 1831 to a moderately prosperous family in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, he had received what was considered a respectable education, including 2 years at a Philadelphia seminary. Though he never completed his ministerial studies, the theological foundation would later inform his role as a deacon in Hollow Creek. County records in Pennsylvania document his marriage to Sarah Thornton in 1848, followed by their relocation to western Pennsylvania, where Thomas briefly operated a bookshop specializing in scientific and philosophical texts. Sarah's death in 1851 was attributed to brain fever in the official record, though contemporary medical historians note this diagnosis was often applied to various neurological and psychological conditions that were poorly understood at the time. Thomas's decision to relocate to the relatively undeveloped Ozark region represented a significant departure from his previous life. He arrived in Missouri with substantial financial resources, purchasing not only the original homestead, but also timber rights to several hundred acres of surrounding forest. His integration into the community was gradual but effective. By 1855, he had established himself as a respected local figure, contributing to the construction of the Methodist Church and occasionally serving as an informal magistrate in minor disputes. His apparent transformation from urban intellectual to frontier landowner was remarkable, though perhaps not entirely complete. Several accounts note that the Rockbridge home contained one of the most extensive private libraries in the region, with volumes ranging from contemporary medical texts to more obscure philosophical works. The arrival of Thomas Rockbridge's cousin, Elias Rockbridge, in June of 1874 coincided with further changes in the household routine. County records confirm that Elias, previously a resident of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, purchased the adjacent property to the east, though he spent considerable time at the main Rockbridge residence. The nature of Elias's business in the Ozarks was never clearly established. Some accounts suggest he had medical training, though no formal credentials were ever verified. Martha Simmons noted in her statement that Elias frequently purchased significant quantities of salt, alcohol, and various herbs from her store, explaining these were for preservative purposes. Elias Rockbridge presented something of an enigma to the residents of Hollow Creek. Approximately 10 years younger than Thomas, he displayed the refined mannerisms and vocabulary of an educated Easterner, yet seemed uncomfortable in social settings. According to multiple accounts, he spoke with a slight accent that some attributed to time spent abroad, possibly in Europe. His appearance was distinctive, tall and gaunt, with unusually pale complexion and prematurely silver hair despite being only in his early 30s. Reverend Wilson's journal described their first meeting. Mr. E. Rockbridge seems a man of considerable learning but peculiar demeanor. He maintains such rigid posture that he appears almost artificial in his movements, and his gaze has an intensity that many find discomfiting. During our conversation regarding his cousin's charitable work, he displayed an unexpected fascination with my account of the fever dreams I experienced during my illness last winter, interrupting with numerous questions regarding what he termed the liminal state of consciousness. Clara's increased isolation began shortly after Elias's arrival. Reverend Wilson of the Methodist Church documented in his personal journal, later shared with investigators, that Clara had missed services for 6 consecutive Sundays prior to her disappearance. When Thomas was questioned about his wife's absence, he explained that she was suffering from nervous exhaustion and required rest. Dr. Lawrence Pembroke, the only physician within 20 miles, confirmed being called to the Rockbridge home twice during July. His medical notes describe Clara as exhibiting profound lethargy, pallor, and an inability to maintain focus during conversation. He prescribed a tonic of iron and quinine, though he later admitted to Sheriff Hargrove that he had been uncertain of the precise nature of her condition. During his second visit, Dr. Pembroke reported observing unusual apparatus in what appeared to be a study that had been converted for medical purposes. In his statement, dated November 1874, he described seeing glass vessels of unusual configuration connected by copper tubing, as well as an electrical device somewhat resembling those employed in certain experimental therapies at more progressive institutions. When he inquired about these items, Elias explained they were part of a personal research project into treatments for nervous disorders. Pembroke, whose medical training had been primarily practical rather than academic, admitted to feeling somewhat intimidated by Elias's apparent expertise and did not press for further details. Perhaps most troubling were the accounts provided by Rebecca Miller, whose property bordered the Rockbridge land to the south. In a statement dated November 12, 1874, Miller claimed that on at least 3 occasions in August and September, she had observed Clara walking alone at the edge of the property near dusk. Miller described these encounters. She appeared distracted, clutching her arms about herself, though the evening was not cold. When I called to her, she seemed not to hear me at first. Upon approach, she regarded me as if trying to place my face in her memory, though we had been neighbors for years. She spoke of sounds in the walls of her home and how Thomas insisted she had imagined them. Before I could inquire further, she would abruptly excuse herself, claiming that she must return before dark fell completely. Miller's final encounter with Clara, approximately 2 weeks before her disappearance, contained details she initially withheld from investigators, only revealing them when pressed by Sheriff Hargrove in December. According to this supplementary statement, Clara had appeared unusually lucid during this meeting, confiding that she believed her food was being adulterated with some substance that affected her mind. She reported experiencing gaps in her memory, particularly during evening hours, and sometimes awakening in different clothing than she recalled wearing to bed. Most disturbingly, she claimed to have discovered a small journal hidden beneath a floorboard in her bedroom, which she initially believed to be her own, based on the handwriting's similarity to hers. Upon reading its contents, however, she realized it had been written by Sarah, Thomas's first wife, and documented experiences unnervingly parallel to her own. Miller reported that Clara had become increasingly agitated while relating this information, frequently glancing back toward the house as if fearing observation. She had pressed a small key into Miller's hand, claiming it opened a compartment in her writing desk containing evidence of what they intend. Clara had extracted a promise that if anything should happen to her, Miller would retrieve this evidence and take it directly to authorities outside Hollow Creek, as she did not trust the local constable, who was Thomas's second cousin. Before departing, Clara had made a final cryptic statement. "The passage beneath goes deeper than anyone knows. I've heard voices from below that speak in no language of this earth." Miller admitted to Sheriff Hargrove that she had dismissed this comment as the product of Clara's evidently troubled mind. Miller further revealed that she had attempted to fulfill her promise 3 days after Clara's reported disappearance, approaching the Rockbridge property with the intention of accessing the main house while Thomas and Elias were known to be meeting with timber buyers. However, she discovered Samuel Thatcher patrolling the perimeter of the property, apparently having been instructed to prevent any visitors in the family's absence. Her nerve failing, Miller had retreated without making her presence known. The key Clara had given her was submitted to Sheriff Hargrove as evidence, though the subsequent search of the Rockbridge home failed to locate the writing desk Clara had described. The disappearance might have remained a footnote in local history had it not been for the events of November 1874. Thomas Rockbridge reported a break-in at the property, claiming that personal items had been disturbed and papers scattered in his study. Sheriff Hargrove's investigation revealed no signs of forced entry, but Thomas insisted that someone had been in the house while he and Elias were attending a livestock auction in Springfield. The sheriff's records indicate that particular attention seemed to have been paid to a locked cabinet in Thomas's study, which he claimed contained only family documents of no value to others. This reported break-in coincided with increased activity at the property during nighttime hours. Jacob Turner, whose hunting expeditions occasionally took him near the Rockbridge land after dark, reported observing lights moving within the woods on the northern edge of the property, in an area where no structures were known to exist. In his statement to Sheriff Hargrove, Turner described seeing 3 or 4 lanterns moving in a manner suggesting they were carried by individuals walking in single file toward the ridge on at least 2 occasions in late November. When he mentioned these observations to Thomas Rockbridge during a chance encounter in town, Thomas had reacted with unusual anger, accusing Turner of trespassing and threatening legal action if he continued to hunt in the vicinity of the Rockbridge property. Following this incident, Thomas's behavior reportedly became increasingly erratic. Samuel Thatcher, the farm laborer, provided a statement indicating that Thomas had discharged him without explanation, paying him a full season's wages and instructing him to vacate the property immediately. Jeremiah Caldwell continued to manage the timber operation, but reported that Thomas now communicated with him exclusively through written notes left at the property boundary. Local merchants noted that Elias now conducted all business in town on behalf of the Rockbridge household. The situation reached a critical point in December 1874 when a severe winter storm descended upon the Ozarks. The heavy snowfall isolated Hollow Creek for nearly 2 weeks. According to Rebecca Miller's account, on the night of December 18th, she observed what appeared to be multiple lanterns moving about the Rockbridge property during the height of the storm. The following morning, she noted unusual activity. Thomas and Elias appeared to be loading a wagon despite the nearly impassable conditions. Concerned, Miller attempted to make her way to the property, but was prevented by the deep snow. By December 21st, when paths had been sufficiently cleared, Sheriff Hargrove visited the Rockbridge property at Miller's insistence, only to find the house abandoned. A hasty search revealed that most personal belongings had been removed, though the furniture remained in place. The sheriff's report noted several unusual aspects of the abandoned house. Despite the apparent haste of departure, the property had been left in meticulous order, with no sign of the disorder typically associated with urgent relocation. The kitchen shelves had been completely cleared of food stores, despite the winter season when such provisions would be most essential and difficult to replace. Most notably, the large cabinet in Thomas's study, which had been the focus of the alleged break-in, was not only empty, but appeared to have been thoroughly cleaned with some chemical solution that left a distinctive odor. Perhaps the most perplexing discovery was made in the cellar. The northern wall, where Clara had reportedly heard unusual sounds, showed evidence of recent modification. Several limestone blocks had been removed and then replaced, with fresh mortar still not fully dried at the time of the sheriff's inspection. When these blocks were removed again, they revealed a small opening that appeared to lead to a narrow passage. However, just beyond the opening, the passage had been completely filled with rubble and earth, making further exploration impossible without significant excavation. Given the limited resources available and the absence of clear evidence of criminal activity, Sheriff Hargrove made the decision not to pursue this line of investigation further at that time. What transformed the Rockbridge case from a simple matter of abandonment to something far more disturbing was the discovery made by the new owner of the property in the spring of 1875. Josiah Bennett, who purchased the Rockbridge land at a significantly reduced price in February 1875, began renovations to the main house in April. Workers removing damaged floorboards in the parlor discovered a hidden compartment beneath, containing what appeared to be a journal belonging to Clara Rockbridge. The journal, which covered the period from June to October 1874, was turned over to Sheriff Hargrove and subsequently became part of the official record. Bennett, a former carpenter from Illinois who had relocated to the Ozarks seeking investment opportunities, provided additional context regarding the discovery. According to his statement, the compartment had been constructed with considerable skill, with the floorboards above it modified to appear identical to the surrounding floor when in place. The space was lined with tin, apparently to protect the contents from moisture, and the journal itself had been wrapped in oilcloth, suggesting an intention to preserve it for eventual discovery. These preparations indicated that Clara had taken deliberate steps to ensure that her account would survive, rather than merely hiding the document in haste. The contents of Clara's journal painted a markedly different picture of life at the Rockbridge property than had been previously understood. Her entries described a household governed by increasingly strange rituals and restrictions implemented by Thomas and Elias. She wrote of being forbidden to enter certain rooms at particular hours, of meals taken in silence, and of hushed conversations between the men that would abruptly cease upon her approach. Most distressing were her descriptions of the cellar, which she had initially been prohibited from entering altogether following Elias's arrival. The journal documented Clara's deteriorating sense of reality and growing suspicions about her husband's activities. Early entries displayed a coherent narrative structure and rational consideration of potential explanations for the unusual circumstances. By August, however, her writing had become increasingly disjointed, with passages that contradicted previous statements and occasional lapses into seemingly unrelated philosophical musings. This progression was consistent with her reported physical decline and the nervous exhaustion diagnosed by Dr. Pembroke. An entry dated July 18, 1874 reads, "The sounds continue regardless of T's insistence that I imagine them. They emanate from behind the north wall of the cellar, a peculiar scratching that begins precisely at midnight and continues until approximately 3 o'clock. He claims it is merely the settling of the house timbers, or perhaps mice in the walls, yet when I suggested setting traps, both men objected strongly. I am no longer permitted to descend to the cellar alone, supposedly for fear that I might fall in my weakened condition. I know with certainty that something is being kept from me." A subsequent entry from July 23rd provided more specific details. The sounds have changed in character. What began as scratching now occasionally includes what I can only describe as rhythmic tapping, almost as if conveying some form of communication. Last night, against T's explicit instructions, I descended to the cellar after the household had retired. The tapping responded to my presence, increasing in tempo as I approached the north wall. I placed my hand against the cool limestone and felt distinct vibrations. Something or someone lies beyond that wall, separated by mere inches of stone. I confess that fear prevented me from calling out or making my presence known further. I retreated upstairs and found T standing at the cellar door, his expression unreadable in the darkness. He asked no questions, but this morning my breakfast tea had a peculiar bitter aftertaste I had not noticed previously. By early August, Clara's entries became increasingly disjointed. She described being administered tonics prepared by Elias, after which she would experience periods of extreme drowsiness and confusion. "I wake with no memory of the evening hours," she wrote on August 9th. T assures me that I have simply been sleeping, yet I find evidence to the contrary: mud on my slippers, pine needles in my hair. I have begun to suspect that something occurs during these lost hours, some purpose to which I am unknowingly contributing. The locked room in the east wing now appears to have been recently used, though both T and E deny having entered it. An entry dated August the 17th contained a detailed description of this locked room, which Clara claimed to have finally accessed using a duplicate key she had secretly commissioned from the blacksmith during a rare unaccompanied visit to town. The room has been transformed into what I can only describe as a laboratory. The furniture has been removed except for a single chair fixed to the floor at the center, with leather straps attached to the arms and legs. A complex apparatus occupies the north wall, glass vessels connected by copper tubing, culminating in what appears to be a mask designed to fit over the face. The eastern wall is covered entirely with papers, diagrams, mathematical calculations, and texts in what appears to be Latin and Greek, though some symbols are unfamiliar to me. Most disturbing was the discovery of a small book on the single desk, a record of observations in E's handwriting, with my name appearing repeatedly throughout. The entries describe my progress in terms I do not fully comprehend, with references to increased receptivity and liminal awareness. The final pages contain a new name: Subject C, prepared for Phase 2 beginning August 21st. So today is August 20th. I must act quickly. The subsequent entry, dated August 20, suggested that Clara's planned action had been thwarted. I have no memory of yesterday. T claims I suffered a fainting spell in the garden and was confined to bed throughout the day and night. Yet I found a small puncture wound in the crook of my arm this morning, partially concealed by a bruise. When questioned, E explained that he had administered a beneficial serum while I was unconscious. Since waking, I have experienced a persistent ringing in my ears and occasional visual distortions, shadows that seem to move independently of their sources. Most troubling is the voice I now hear clearly at night, a whispering that seems to emanate not from the cellar but from within my own mind, speaking words I cannot quite comprehend, but which fill me with inexplicable dread. Perhaps most alarming was Clara's description of discovering a hidden journal belonging to Thomas's first wife, Sarah. According to Clara's account, she located this document concealed within the lining of an old trunk in the attic. The journal, which Clara described as fragmentary and often incoherent, contained entries from 1850-1851, leading up to Sarah's reported death from fever. Clara transcribed several passages, including one that mirrored her own experiences with disturbing precision. T insists the noises from below are merely my imagination, a symptom of my nervous disposition. Yet I know what I hear, movement where no movement should be possible. E arrives tomorrow. T claims his medical knowledge may help my condition, though I have expressed no need for such intervention. Clara's journal documented increasing paranoia throughout September, with frequent references to being watched even when alone. She described discovering small objects moved from their usual positions, pages in her personal books, dog-eared at passages she had not been reading, and occasionally waking to find Elias sitting in a chair across her bedroom, ostensibly monitoring her condition, during the night. Her writing during this period frequently digressed into philosophical considerations of consciousness and reality, citing texts that Thomas had apparently encouraged her to read, including works by obscure European philosophers whose theories regarding the permeability of perceptual boundaries had been largely dismissed by mainstream academia. A particularly disturbing entry, dated September 29th, described what Clara believed to be an organized ritual conducted on the property. I feigned consumption of E's evening tonic, but disposed of it in the potted plant beside my bed. Around midnight, I observed T and E leaving the house with lanterns, proceeding toward the northern woods. Despite my fear, I followed at a distance. They joined 3 other men at a clearing approximately half a mile from the house. One I recognized as J.C., presumably Jeremiah Caldwell, the others unfamiliar to me. The group descended through what appeared to be a sinkhole concealed by brush, carrying their lanterns and a large wooden box between them. I dared not approach closer, but waited nearly 3 hours until they emerged. The box was no longer with them. Upon their return to the clearing, T and the others consumed something from a flask passed between them, after which their behavior became erratic, movements unnaturally rigid, voices raised in what sounded like chanting, though I could not distinguish the words at that distance. I retreated before their departure, but am certain they remained until nearly dawn. This morning, E examined the plant beside my bed with unusual interest. The final dated entry in Clara's journal was October 16, 1874, the day before she was reported missing. It consists of a single paragraph. I have located the source of the sounds. Behind the false wall in the north corner of the cellar, there exists a narrow passage leading downward, while T and E were meeting with J.C. Regarding the timber contracts, I managed to dislodge several stones and create an opening large enough to insert a lantern. What I saw cannot be explained by any rational means. I have documented my findings and placed this record where it might eventually be discovered, should what I now suspect come to pass. T has been administering some substance with my evening tea. Tonight I shall only pretend to drink. The remainder of the journal was empty, leaving the precise nature of Clara's discovery unrecorded. Sheriff Hargrove's subsequent investigation of the cellar revealed the false wall Clara had described, but the passage beyond had apparently collapsed. Whether this was due to natural causes or deliberate action remained undetermined. A thorough search of the remaining property yielded no additional evidence regarding Clara's fate. The case took an unexpected turn in May of 1875, when reports emerged from Springfield of a woman matching Clara's description seeking passage on a westbound train. The ticket agent, Henry Donovan, provided a statement indicating that the woman had appeared disoriented and fearful, repeatedly glancing over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. She had purchased a ticket to St. Louis using cash and had identified herself as Mrs. Weber, Clara's maiden name. Donovan's description of the woman's appearance was consistent with Clara Rockbridge, including a distinctive scar on her right hand that Clara was known to have acquired in a kitchen accident in 1869. Donovan's account included several details that had not been previously publicized, lending credibility to the identification. He described the woman as unnaturally pale, with dark circles beneath her eyes, suggesting prolonged illness or lack of sleep. She had spoken in a whisper, as if unaccustomed to using her voice, and had startled visibly at loud noises in the station. Most notably, she had refused to sit with her back to any doorway, repeatedly changing positions to maintain sightlines to all entrances. These behaviors suggested a state of extreme vigilance, consistent with someone fearing pursuit. The woman had been carrying minimal luggage, a single carpet bag that appeared only partially filled. When asked about her destination beyond St. Louis, she had reportedly given vague answers mentioning California, but providing no specific city. She had paid for her ticket with an assortment of coins and small denomination bills, counting them with unusual care, as if unaccustomed to handling money. After purchasing her ticket, she had not waited in the public areas of the station, but had instead positioned herself on the platform despite the train's scheduled departure being nearly 2 hours later. Sheriff Hargrove traveled to St. Louis in June 1875 to investigate this lead, but the trail had gone cold. No passenger matching Clara's description had registered at any of the hotels near the station during the relevant period, and inquiries at the onward ticket offices yielded no definitive information. The possibility remained that Clara had indeed escaped the Rockbridge household and established a new identity elsewhere, though the circumstances of her departure and the prolonged absence of any communication with former friends or neighbors in Hollow Creek suggested a deep and persistent fear. In St. Louis, Sheriff Hargrove visited several hospitals and charitable institutions, reasoning that a woman in Clara's apparent condition might have sought assistance. At the Sisters of Mercy Hospital, he discovered a potential lead. Records indicated that a woman who had not provided a name had been treated for exhaustion and malnourishment in late May, with symptoms suggesting she had traveled a considerable distance on foot or in difficult conditions. The attending physician's notes described the patient as uncommunicative regarding her circumstances and displaying signs of recent trauma, both physical and psychological. The woman had remained at the hospital for only 2 days before departing against medical advice when questions regarding her identity became more persistent. As for Thomas and Elias Rockbridge, they appeared to have relocated to Colorado Territory, according to correspondence intercepted by Sheriff Hargrove in late 1875. A letter addressed to Jeremiah Caldwell regarding the continued management of the timber operation referenced their establishment of a new enterprise near Denver. Subsequent inquiries to authorities in that region confirmed that individuals matching their descriptions had purchased a substantial property in a remote area approximately 30 miles west of Denver, in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Local records indicated that they had established what was described as a private research facility and had applied for permits to conduct mining operations, though the precise nature of the materials they sought to extract was not specified. No criminal charges were ever filed in connection with Clara's disappearance, as no conclusive evidence of foul play had been established. The sheriff's investigation was officially closed in December 1875, with Clara's status listed as whereabouts unknown, presumed departed of her own volition. The Rockbridge property changed hands several times in the subsequent decades. Local accounts suggest that no owner remained in residence for more than 2 years, with most citing uncomfortable atmospherics or unsuitability for family life as reasons for selling. By 1890, the original structure had been largely abandoned and had fallen into disrepair. In 1893, a fire of undetermined origin consumed what remained of the main house. The property was eventually absorbed into what would become the Mark Twain National Forest in the early 20th century. Interest in the Rockbridge case experienced a revival in 1937 when a graduate student named Martin Holloway from the University of Missouri began researching disappeared persons in the Ozarks region during the post-Civil War period. Holloway's investigation led him to the Greene County Archives, where he examined the original case files and Clara's recovered journal. His subsequent thesis, titled Patterns of Disappearance Ozark Communities 1865-1880, dedicated a chapter to the Rockbridge case, drawing parallels between Clara's disappearance and several similar incidents in neighboring counties during the same period. Holloway noted particular similarities in cases where individuals had reported unusual sounds or disturbances prior to their disappearances. He documented at least 7 instances within a 50-mile radius where missing persons had previously described hearing unexplained noises emanating from beneath their properties. In 4 of these cases, including Clara's, the properties in question had been situated above what geological surveys would later identify as extensive limestone cave systems. Most intriguing was Holloway's discovery of a possible connection between Elias Rockbridge and a physician named Elias Rothman, who had been associated with the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane prior to 1870. Hospital records indicated that Rothman had been dismissed following allegations of experimental procedures conducted without proper authorization. The precise nature of these experiments was not detailed in the available documents, but references to exploration of altered consciousness and investigations into the liminal state between wakefulness and sleep suggested controversial approaches to treating mental illness. Holloway proposed that Elias Rockbridge and Elias Rothman might have been the same individual, having changed his surname slightly upon relocating to the Ozarks. Holloway's research uncovered additional connections that had not been previously established. Thomas Rockbridge's bookshop in Pennsylvania had specialized in scientific and philosophical texts that, while not necessarily controversial by the standards of the time, represented decidedly unorthodox interests. Sales records indicated that he had imported works by obscure European philosophers and scientists whose theories regarding human consciousness had been largely rejected by mainstream academia. Of particular note were several volumes dealing with mesmerism and animal magnetism, early precursors to hypnotic theory that proposed the existence of invisible forces that might be manipulated to affect physical and mental states. Furthermore, Holloway discovered correspondence between Thomas and several academic figures associated with fringe scientific pursuits. These letters, preserved in the archives of a Philadelphia scientific society, discussed theories regarding what was termed the permeability of perceptual boundaries and communication across the threshold of conventional awareness. Several referenced experiments conducted in Europe that had allegedly demonstrated the possibility of inducing transcendent states through various combinations of chemical compounds, electrical stimulation, and hypnotic suggestion. Most significantly, Holloway identified a potential explanation for the Rockbridges' specific interest in the Ozark region. In an 1849 monograph titled Geological Anomalies and Their Metaphysical Implications, an obscure German geologist named Friedrich Schaller had proposed that certain limestone cave formations created resonant chambers that might amplify or channel what he termed ethereal energies. Schaller had specifically identified several regions in North America, including the Ozark Mountains, as potential locations where these conditions might exist. Thomas Rockbridge had not only possessed a copy of this exceedingly rare work, but had annotated it extensively, particularly the sections dealing with the Ozarks. The Holloway thesis generated limited academic interest when completed in 1939, and the outbreak of World War II soon diverted attention from such historical investigations. Holloway himself joined the war effort and was killed in action in the Pacific Theater in 1944. His research materials were eventually donated to the University of Missouri Archives, where they remained largely undisturbed until 1961. In that year, a series of geological surveys were conducted throughout the Ozarks region as part of a federal water management project. The survey team working in the vicinity of the former Rockbridge property made a discovery that briefly revived interest in the historical case. Approximately 1/4 mile north of where the Rockbridge house had stood, researchers discovered a sinkhole leading to a previously unmapped cave system. Initial exploration revealed evidence of human activity within the cave, including metal fixtures embedded in the limestone walls that appeared to date from the late 19th century. Most notably, a small chamber, roughly 300 feet from the entrance, contained what appeared to be a wooden chair with restraint fixtures attached to the arms and legs. Dr. Caroline Shepard, an archaeologist from Washington University in St. Louis, who was called to examine the site, documented her findings in a report submitted to the Department of the Interior in November 1961. She noted that the chamber showed signs of deliberate modification, with the natural limestone having been carved to create a roughly rectangular space. Additional artifacts recovered included several glass bottles of a type consistent with medical usage in the 1870s, fragments of what appeared to be journal pages, too deteriorated to be legible, and a woman's tortoiseshell hair comb with the initials CR engraved on the handle. The chamber's most striking feature was its acoustic properties. Shepard's report noted that sounds produced within the space created unusual resonance patterns, with certain tones seeming to amplify while others were dampened. Most peculiarly, sounds from outside the chamber were almost completely inaudible within it, creating what Shepard described as an environment of profound auditory isolation. This characteristic aligned disturbingly well with Clara's journal descriptions of being unable to hear responses to her calls when exploring the passage from the cellar, despite the relatively short distance involved. Shepard's report hypothesized that the cave might have been accessed from the Rockbridge property via the passageway Clara had described in her journal. The collapse mentioned in Sheriff Hargrove's investigation could have been intentionally engineered to conceal this connection. Shepard proposed that the chamber had been used for some unknown purpose by Thomas and Elias Rockbridge, possibly related to the experimental procedures with which Elias had been previously associated. The presence of the restraint chair suggested that these activities may have been conducted on unwilling subjects. Further exploration of the cave system revealed additional chambers, though none showed the same degree of modification as the first. Approximately 500 feet deeper into the system, the survey team discovered a natural chamber containing a pool of unusually clear water. The pool's surface was perfectly still despite the presence of what appeared to be a natural outlet, suggesting some form of underground damming had occurred. Near this pool, embedded in a crevice in the wall, researchers found a small leather-bound notebook, its pages largely destroyed by moisture, but with portions of the cover still intact. The remains of an inscription were visible, property of TR. The contents, however, were too degraded to yield any legible information. The implications regarding Clara's fate remained speculative. No human remains were discovered in the initial survey of the cave system, and a more thorough exploration planned for the following spring was abruptly canceled when funding for the project was redirected. The cave entrance was documented in geological records, but was not developed for public access, and its precise location was not widely publicized. By 1963, natural erosion and vegetation had largely concealed the entrance once again. Dr. Shepard attempted to pursue further investigation independently, applying for grants to fund a dedicated archaeological study of the site. Her applications were consistently declined, with review committees citing insufficient historical significance and speculative connection to documented events. Frustrated by this lack of institutional support, Shepard compiled her findings into a monograph titled Subterranean Secrets: The Rockbridge Mystery Reconsidered, which she self-published in 1965. The publication received little attention outside of a small circle of Ozark historians and was out of print by 1967. In her monograph, Shepard proposed a theory regarding the Rockbridge's activities that connected the various pieces of evidence into a coherent, if disturbing, narrative. She suggested that Thomas Rockbridge had developed an obsession with the theories presented in Schaller's geological text regarding ethereal energies and their potential manifestation in limestone cave systems. This interest, combined with Elias's apparent background in experimental psychology and medicine, had led them to establish a research facility focused on exploring altered states of consciousness. The remote location in the Ozarks provided both the geological features they sought and the privacy to conduct experiments that would have been considered unethical by conventional standards. Shepard theorized that Sarah, Thomas's first wife, had likely been an early subject in these experiments, possibly resulting in her death, or alternatively, necessitating the fabrication of her death and subsequent confinement if the experiments had produced unforeseen psychological effects. Clara, selected as Thomas's second wife due to physical or psychological characteristics the Rockbridges considered suitable for their work, had eventually become their primary subject. The tonics and other substances administered to her were likely designed to increase susceptibility to whatever phenomenon they were attempting to induce or observe. The modified chamber in the cave, with its unusual acoustic properties, suggested experiments involving sensory deprivation or manipulation, conditions known to facilitate hallucinations and altered states of consciousness. The restraint chair indicated that these experiences may have produced violent or uncontrolled reactions in subjects. Shepard proposed that the ultimate goal of these experiments might have been to achieve some form of communication or perception beyond normal human experience, possibly influenced by emerging spiritualist movements of the period, but approached through pseudoscientific methodology rather than religious framework. In a curious footnote to her investigation, Shepard's personal papers, now held by the Missouri Historical Society, include correspondence dated February 1966 from a woman identifying herself as Ellen Weber of Sacramento, California. The letter claimed that the writer was the granddaughter of Clara Rockbridge, who had allegedly escaped to California and lived under an assumed name until her death in 1928. The letter contained details about the Rockbridge case that aligned with the historical record, including descriptions of the property that would have been difficult to fabricate without first-hand knowledge. Weber's letter provided an account of Clara's escape that filled several gaps in the historical record. According to this narrative, Clara had indeed feigned consumption of the drug tea on October 16th, as indicated in her final journal entry. When Thomas and Elias believed she was unconscious, they had transported her to the cave chamber, or what Weber described as the final phase of their experiment. Clara had managed to free herself when left temporarily unattended, fleeing through passages in the cave system that she had secretly explored during previous episodes when she had been brought there in a semi-conscious state. The letter claimed that Clara had emerged from a different entrance to the cave system several miles from the Rockbridge property, disoriented and suffering exposure, but determined to escape. She had walked nearly 20 miles before encountering a sympathetic farmer who had transported her to Springfield, where she had indeed purchased a ticket to St. Louis under her maiden name. From St. Louis she had continued westward, eventually settling in Northern California under the name Eleanor Weber, living in constant fear of discovery by Thomas and Elias, whom she believed would never abandon their search for her. According to Weber's account, Clara had married again in 1880 and had raised 3 children, telling them only that she was a widow who had left Missouri to escape painful memories. Only in her final years, as her health failed, had she revealed the full story to her daughter, Ellen Weber's mother, extracting a promise that the truth would not be shared until well after her death, when all those involved would presumably be deceased as well. Weber requested a copy of Shepard's monograph and offered to share family documents that might shed additional light on Clara's experiences. Shepard's response, dated March 1966, enthusiastically accepted this offer and suggested a meeting. However, subsequent letters from Shepard went unanswered, and her notes indicate that a registered letter sent in June 1966 was returned marked addressee unknown. Whether Ellen Weber was truly Clara's descendant or the letter represented some form of elaborate hoax remains undetermined. The Rockbridge case receded from even local memory as the decades passed. The land where the homestead once stood became increasingly remote as the surrounding forest reclaimed what had once been cleared for agriculture. Occasional hikers in the national forest reported finding stone foundations and the remnants of a root cellar. But without knowledge of the historical context, these discoveries were generally dismissed as the unremarkable remains of an abandoned farmstead. In 1968, a severe storm system passed through the Ozarks, causing significant flooding and numerous landslides throughout the region. One such landslide occurred in the vicinity of the former Rockbridge property, altering the landscape considerably. Forest Service personnel surveying the damage reported that the area where Dr. Shepard had documented the cave entrance appeared to have collapsed entirely, with thousands of tons of soil and rock filling what had once been a sinkhole. Any physical evidence that might have remained from the 1870s was presumed to have been destroyed or rendered permanently inaccessible by this event. The collapse generated brief interest among geologists studying the impact of surface water infiltration on limestone cave systems. Dr. Robert Matheson, a geologist from the University of Arkansas who visited the site in early 1969, noted in his field report that the pattern of collapse was unusual for natural processes, with the failure appearing to have originated from within the cave system, rather than resulting from external pressure. He speculated that decades of structural modifications might have compromised the natural stability of the cavern, creating vulnerabilities that eventually led to catastrophic failure when subjected to the additional stress of heavy rainfall. And so the case of Clara Rockbridge might have remained, an obscure historical curiosity, occasionally referenced in academic works on 19th century rural life or compilations of Ozark folklore. However, a final unsettling coda to the story emerged in 1969, when renovations to the Greene County Courthouse uncovered a sealed compartment within a wall of the original sheriff's office. Inside was a metal box containing what appeared to be evidence related to cases from the 1870s, including a sealed envelope labeled Rockbridge Supplementary. The envelope contained a single document, a handwritten letter dated December 30th, 1875, addressed to Sheriff James Hargrove from a Dr. Leonard Blackwood of St. Louis. The letter referenced a female patient who had been admitted to the St. Louis Hospital for the Insane in May of that year, having been found wandering near the train station in a state of extreme disorientation. The patient, who initially identified herself only as Clara, had eventually provided her full name as Clara Rockbridge of Hollow Creek, Missouri. Dr. Blackwood's letter described Clara's mental state as profoundly disturbed upon admission. She had exhibited extreme agitation when approached by male staff members and had repeatedly insisted that they would find her if she revealed her true identity. Over several months of treatment, Clara had gradually become more communicative, eventually providing an account of events that Blackwood felt compelled to report to the authorities in Hollow Creek, despite his patient's objections. According to this account, Thomas and Elias Rockbridge had indeed been engaged in some form of experimentation involving the cave system beneath their property. Clara claimed that Thomas had been obsessed with certain aspects of mesmerism and animal magnetism since before their marriage, beliefs that had been reinforced and expanded upon following Elias's arrival. She described being administered substances that induced a trance-like state, during which she would be led through to the passage in the cellar to the chamber within the cave. Blackwood's letter included detailed transcriptions of Clara's descriptions of these experiences. She reported being secured in the restraint chair and subjected to various combinations of sensory deprivation, hypnotic suggestion, and what she described as electrical influences administered through apparatus attached to her head and spine. During these sessions, Thomas and Elias would position themselves at specific points around the chamber, creating what Clara described as a triangle of influence that supposedly facilitated the phenomenon they were attempting to induce. The nature of the experiments remained somewhat unclear even in Clara's more lucid moments. She referred repeatedly to attempts to pierce the veil and commune with what lies beyond the boundaries of waking consciousness. She claimed that Thomas believed certain caves in the Ozarks represented thin places where communication with other realms of existence might be possible under the right conditions. Elias had apparently provided the methodological framework for these experiments, combining his medical knowledge with concepts drawn from various esoteric traditions. Clara described experiencing profound hallucinations during these sessions, including perceptions of spaces that seemed to exist beyond the physical confines of the cave. She reported hearing voices speaking in languages she could not identify but somehow understood, conveying concepts that she struggled to articulate in conventional terms. Most disturbing were her descriptions of presences she sensed during these episodes, entities that she believed were being deliberately contacted or summoned by the Rockbridge's procedures. According to Blackwood's transcription, Clara believed that these entities had become increasingly interested in her over the course of the experiments, eventually attempting to communicate with her even when she was not in the cave chamber. She attributed the sounds she had heard in the walls of the house to these entities seeking entry into the physical world. Her most terrifying claim was that during her final session in the cave, she had become convinced that one such entity had partially merged with her consciousness, creating a state she described as neither fully myself nor fully other. Most disturbing was Clara's assertion that she had not been the first subject of these experiments. She claimed to have discovered evidence suggesting that Thomas's first wife, Sarah, had been subjected to similar treatments prior to her supposed death from fever. Clara believed that the official account of Sarah's death had been falsified and that the true circumstances had been concealed. Whether Sarah had died as a result of the experiments or had, like Clara, managed to escape remained unknown. Dr. Blackwood noted that while many aspects of Clara's account seemed implausible and potentially the product of delusion, certain details corresponded with independently verifiable facts. Her descriptions of the Rockbridge property, the community of Hollow Creek, and various individuals were consistent with reality. Moreover, her physical condition upon admission, including evidence of prolonged restraint at the wrists and ankles, and needle marks consistent with regular administration of sedatives, supported at least some elements of her story. The letter concluded with a request for information regarding whether Thomas and Elias Rockbridge had been located, as Clara remained convinced that they would continue searching for her. Dr. Blackwood expressed particular concern regarding Clara's recent insistence that she could still hear them calling across the divide, despite being hundreds of miles from the Ozarks. He recommended that any response be directed to him personally rather than the hospital, as he had not informed his superiors of his communication with Hollow Creek authorities. No record of a response from Sheriff Hargrove has been found. The sheriff's logbook indicates that he retired from his position in January 1876, just days after the letter would have arrived. His successor, Sheriff William Tanner, appears to have had no knowledge of the Rockbridge case beyond the official file, which had been closed the previous month. Dr. Blackwood's letter was apparently filed away without action and subsequently forgotten when the sheriff's office was relocated within the courthouse in 1877. As for Clara Rockbridge, hospital records indicate that a patient matching her description remained at the St. Louis Hospital for the Insane until November 1876, when she was released into the care of a cousin who had been located in Chicago. The hospital's discharge notes describe her condition as significantly improved, though still subject to occasional nervous agitation. No further official documentation of Clara's life has been discovered, lending some credibility to the possibility that she did indeed relocate to California and establish a new identity, as suggested by the letter to Dr. Shepard nearly a century later. The limestone caves beneath the former Rockbridge property remain unexplored to this day. The landslide of 1968 rendered the original entrance inaccessible, and subsequent geological surveys have indicated that the cave system is now largely flooded due to changes in the water table over the past century. Whatever secrets might still be contained within that darkness are likely to remain undisturbed indefinitely. Perhaps that is for the best. As Clara herself wrote in what may have been her final coherent journal entry, some passages once opened cannot be easily sealed again. Some knowledge once acquired cannot be forgotten, regardless of how fervently one might wish it so. The case of Clara Rockbridge stands as a reminder that even in the seemingly familiar landscape of rural America, there exist spaces beyond our understanding, dark corners where the conventional boundaries of existence may become disturbingly permeable. The Rockbridge homestead is gone, the cave entrance sealed, the principals long deceased. Yet something of their story persists, echoing across the decades like those inexplicable sounds Clara described, scratching at the walls of memory, emerging in the deepest hours of the night, suggesting that beneath the surface of our accepted reality, other possibilities await discovery by those unfortunate enough to hear their call.